Great. So I am so happy to see such a fabulous list of names showing up in the attendee list, as well as in the chat, to see people from all over. I know we have people calling in from pretty much every time zone imaginable. So some of you late in your evening on Monday, and some of you very early starts on the West Coast of the United States, and all points in between. I'm Mitchell Warren. I'm the director of AVAC, and delighted to welcome everybody to this webinar. It's actually kind of hard to believe what has happened in the last, well, over a year for all of us around the world with respect to the realities in which we live with a new pandemic. But it's also remarkable that in that intervening year, almost exactly a year ago, we got news from in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic of exciting and important news in HIV prevention research. Not quite a one-year anniversary to when we first heard about early results from HPTN 083, but it has been about almost 12 months of finding out more information, more interesting information, more exciting information, more challenging information about long-acting injectable Cabotegravir, a product under investigation for HIV prevention. And delighted to welcome a number of colleagues on this call to provide updates and perspective on what we are learning, what we now know, what we think we know, and what we may learn going into the future. Just to give you a quick run of show, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, very much want to encourage people to engage, and feel free to put questions as you hear the presentations and conversation in the Q&A feature of Zoom. If for some reason you're dialing in on phone and don't have access, you can also email avac@avac.org and we'll get your question in the queue. We're going to have a couple of presentations up front and perspectives shared, and then we will go into a moderated discussion. I'll introduce a number of people who you're going to hear from. I'm delighted, in addition to the investigators from HPTN 083 and 084, who I'll introduce in a minute, delighted to welcome a number of leading advocates from around the world to help frame the conversation and engage in a conversation with the researchers. We're going to start with perspectives from Chilufya Hamponga, who is a leading advocate at the Treatment Advocacy and Literacy Campaign, TALC, in Zambia. Chilufya was an AVAC fellow several years ago, and delighted to see her continued leadership and involvement in Zambia, and frankly internationally, in research advocacy. She's going to be joined by three additional leading advocates. Richard Lusimbo, who many of you know, a leading activist from Uganda. Many of you will know from Sexual Minorities Uganda. He's now one of the leaders of Pan-Africa ILGA, and delighted to have Richard with us. Sibongile Maseko, a leading women's health advocate from Eswatini, an epidemiologist as well as an advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights. She and Chilufya were both quite involved in the ECHO trial, a trial that many of you will know, which allowed advocates to really expand their work in integration SRH activities, a research result that came out now almost 2 years ago, but delighted to have both of them here. And then I'm delighted to have my dear friend and colleague Emily Bass, who directs strategy and content at AVAC, also quite involved in ECHO and in a number of advocacy activities. So you'll hear from all of them. And you'll hear from two of the protocol chairs of HPTN 083 and 084, Rafi Landovitz at UCLA in California. So he's calling in quite early this morning. He was one of the protocol chairs for HPTN 083. And Sinead Delaney Moretle from WIT's Reproductive Health and HIV Institute in South Africa, who was one of the protocol chairs for HPTN 084. And I'll be reintroducing some of these people as we go, but wanted to mention all of that up front. So welcome all again. We're really excited to have all of you on the line. And I'm going to first turn it over to Chilufya from TALC in Zambia to provide some perspective on prevention now and into the future. So Chilufya, take it away.
Thank you, Mitchell. Happy to be here. Last year, 2020, was not just a bad year, but it also presented us with, exciting news, as Mitchell had already alluded to. HPTN or 84 gave wonderful results, and it was a cause for celebration for not only women, but everyone. And also being alive to the fact that when there's an addition of another product to the already existing HIV prevention options, it's always exciting. But for advocates, we're not swayed just by, celebrations and all that. It also calls for finding out what are the missing pieces. What is the data telling us? What should we tell the communities? And that's when the work for us begins. So early this year, advocates have been engaging with communities, trying to find out what do communities feel about the new jab, which is called Cabotegravir, long-acting Cabotegravir. It's very exciting for the community, I should say, but there are always missing pieces in the puzzle, because as we know, there's some data which is lacking, which we don't have answers to as advocates. In my case, when I'm engaging with communities, they don't just want to take in everything. They want to ask you questions. And as advocates, we're truth tellers. So I feel this is an opportunity for me to try and ask some of those questions that are coming out of, the community. And as women advocates, we're just not interested in prevention, but also women. They are at the core of our, work. Levi, could you try and show the slides? So what are the missing pieces in the puzzle? As you can see on the screen there, I think when you talk about a new prevention option, people want to know, when are we getting this? Because you're just not exciting the community, but the community want to know, are you telling me about something that I can find at the facility tomorrow? If you don't have an answer, they'll be like, but why and where? So those are some of the pertinent questions that also need to be answered. And not only that, we know when the data was presented for HPTN or 84, there were questions with the tail. So the community never gave it a blind eye. They wanted to know, how does resistance emerge with people who use Cabotegravir in the trials? This question has been very frequent from all the 3 districts who are engaged, including Lusaka. So I would want our 2 scientists or researchers to help with these questions. And also, we know that if we are talking about resistance, obviously we are alive to the fact that the people who seroconvert when they start using these products. So what are the treatment options for people who acquire HIV while using Cabotegravir? These questions are very important because we know governments need to put investment plans. For instance, when they have people seroconverting during the use of these products, the government should be able to give an answer or help when these people go to their facilities. Last year, 2020, I remember the advocates from different corners were called for a meeting with VIV. During that engagement, we saw it fit that we need to know, because we've learned from the past, research trials, and also when it's time to roll out new products, there is need for community engagement. So what is the plan for the community engagement? We asked this question, and this has been very resounding. But up to now, VIV has not been able to commit to ongoing engagement, despite us knocking as civil society. And we've seen this has affected also the PEPFAR core process, because we don't see a clear way forward for robust leadership. Even though daily oral PrEP tells us that this is needed, we can see a lot of engagement on the part of the devouring ring, where we're seeing a PROMISE team trying to engage with in-country teams. But for Cabotegravir, it's like the leadership is so unclear. So it is very important that the community engagement plan is well mapped out and also cleared. so that advocates know what they're getting themselves into. And we know that despite having this new option, we know women need to have another way to protect themselves, which in this case, Kabele presents that opportunity. But we know that Kabele will never replace the pill because it's not for everyone. So how are we going to make sure that women are given a chance to choose what they want? Because we know women are diverse and we can't police their bodies by, putting preference on what others feel could be more preferential due to the efficacy levels that has come out from the research trials. So in this regard, we'd want to know as advocates, how is choice going to be prioritized? Because this we've learned from the contraceptive field, where we see a lot of women being told, oh no, women love Depo, when we know that it is not actually for everyone, but only maybe a section of women who find it to be very, very, very conducive for them, but we won't put it as a blanket, as we know not one size fits all. So we would also love to hear how this program, when Kabele is rolled out, how will that support preference and choice? Because now we don't just talk about prevention and options. We want to prioritize choice. We want women to make a choice. We want all the people that are at risk of HIV make a choice without being coerced. Next slide. So those are some of the missing pieces in the puzzle. So now, to sum it up, we would want to get a better understanding of the risk resistance and duration of the pharmacokinetic tail. This is very key. I would want to go back to my community with an answer the next time I start engaging with them. And we know that one of the major barriers to access and availability is the price. So if price is not well done, it will hinder the uptake. As we know, some of the countries up to now don't have PrEP. So worse enough, if there is no clarity on price, that will also impact on the availability of Kabele in some of these resource-constrained communities. So this is very key as well. What we've also learned with the use of oral PrEP is that there is need for consistency in messaging. How then is Kabele going to fit in with new products like the depaverin ring and the familiar ones like daily oral PrEP? One thing for sure is advocates don't want to hear that this one should come first because it has shown higher efficacy. We want to have consistent messaging with clear, messages helping people to make a choice on what they want to use. And also the side effects, what should they expect? In short, there is need to have good literacy so that there's consistency in messaging. And lastly, we would like to have a very strong community engagement and leadership. So this presents us an opportunity to work together as advocates and other key stakeholders to see how should the plan look like, who will support what, and who will lead. Because if we don't do this, there is a very high chance of, having not so much support, because we've seen it, the DVR, in the core process right now, it's on top of the list. People are pushing the agenda to make sure that people get the depaverin ring. But what about the Kabele? Thank you.
Chilufia, thank you so very much. A great scene setter for the conversations to come and issues, some of which we will absolutely address here and many of which will unfold in the weeks and months to follow. But that was terrific, and thank you. I'll now turn to Sinead to provide some perspective on HPTN 084. And as I said, Sinead is based at WITS RHI and was one of the protocol leads for the trial.
Thanks, Mitchell. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
That is perfect.
All right, so I'm just listening to Chalufia's comments. I think sort of I come into this conversation with two hats. The first hat I wear is as HPTN 084 protocol chair and trialist, and hope to share with you the answers that I think the trial can answer, but also what we hope to learn from the open label extension. The second hat I wear is as someone who is a South African and has worked in HIV prevention for many years and is also part of the PrEP TWG. So can certainly reflect on what I think we need to think of as we think about programs. And those are probably two different roles, but I think it's important to be able to reflect on both those perspectives, because I think some of the things the trial can't answer, but certainly based on our experience of introducing PrEP into South Africa, there may be useful sort of comments to make in that regard. So I know that for many of you, you know much of what I'm going to share with you, but I thought it was just useful to do a quick recap and also to kind of remind you of some of the things that I think have become talking points with time. And the first is that both HPTN 083 and 084 were trials that compared Cabotegravir to daily oral TDF-FTC. So they were the first trials with an active comparator, unlike previous prevention trials that had been compared to placebo. And so all the results are really presented relative to daily oral Truvada. And that's because daily oral Truvada has been considered as the standard of care or the standard of prevention when it comes to PrEP. But it's important, I think, when reflecting on these results to acknowledge that this was a comparative trial with an active comparator, and we do present the data relative to our existing current PrEP approach. So the second thing is just to remind you of the population that enrolled in 084. We enrolled just over 3,200 women from 20 sites in 7 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, where HIV prevalence and incidence are high. We recruited women aged 18 to 45 who were HIV negative and sexually active, and we used a risk score to identify a population that would be considered PrEP eligible. So we were looking for participants who were interested in taking PrEP and would have qualified for PrEP in terms of sort of national and WHO guidelines. The other important point is that people weren't enrolled if they had contraindications to either agent. And particularly in this trial, we didn't enroll women who were pregnant or breastfeeding. And because of the issue that emerged around dolutegravir, we required women to use a long-acting reversible contraceptive with a failure rate of less than 1%. So the majority of participants in this trial either used an injectable or an IUCD or an implant from about mid-2018. So just to remind you of the design and also to again sort of reflect on some of these steps which have sort of been considered that they were necessary for the trial, but we don't know that they're necessary for programs. So all participants were randomized either to active Cabotegravir or placebo, or active Cabotegravir or placebo Truvada, or else active Truvada and placebo Cabotegravir. And both participants and study staff were blinded to both allocations. Participants went through an initial oral run-in, and then at week 5, they transitioned to injections 8 weeks apart, except for the first 2 injections, which were 4 weeks apart. And during that step, all participants received an injection and all had daily pills. And then anyone who discontinued injections prematurely, either for a safety reason or particularly in the case of pregnancy, they were offered 48 weeks of open label Truvada. So the oral lead-in was the first 5 weeks of oral drug was based on the idea that if we were to detect adverse drug reactions prior to injection, we would within 4 weeks detect about 90% of those adverse drug reactions, and so would be able to prevent anyone transitioning to an injection based on some tolerability concern. So the oral lead-in was really a safety decision out of an abundance of caution in a phase 3 trial where we had limited experience of using Cabotegravir. But as you'll see, this is something that may not be required in programs. And similarly, the use of open-label Truvada to cover the so-called pharmacokinetic tail was also a study design consideration that came out of an abundance of caution and a theoretical concern that if people stopped injections and they had declining levels of Cabotegravir, if they were exposed to an HIV infection and developed HIV, that under the influence of sort of declining levels of CAB and CAB monotherapy, they could theoretically develop a resistant infection. So these two aspects of the trial were really what trialists do, which is to kind of play a very conservative approach in sort of the absence of information. But these two, the first step 2 and step 3, were not necessarily intended for real world use. And I think address some of the questions that Chilufya raised about what we understand about the tail and resistance. And Rafi will certainly provide more insights into that based on what we know from 083. So in 084, we screened almost 5,000 participants and randomized 3,224. And here you will see just the follow-up of participants over time, even during sort of the very harsh lockdowns for COVID in 2020. And I put this slide up just to remind you that this was a population at risk for HIV infection. You can see that 57% were 25 years or younger. The majority didn't live with their partner. About a third of women had a partner who was HIV positive or unknown. Half reported 2 or more sex partners in the past month. 40% reported engaging in transactional sex in the past month, and 6% reported anal sex. And they also had fairly high rates of curable STIs, partly because of the limitations of the STI approach in our region. So this was a PrEP eligible population. And here is the key results from 084, just to remind you that in over almost 4,000 person years of follow-up, we only observed 40 infections with a pooled incidence of 1%. Which is much lower than what we had seen in the region when we looked, when we heard the HPTN 702 results or when we heard the ECHO results. So this was demonstrated for us that both agents were highly effective in preventing HIV infection. When we looked at the distribution of infections, there were 4 in the CAB arm and 36 in the Truvada arm. So the CAB incidence was 0.2% and the incidence in the Truvada group was under 2%. And when we compared the rates of infections across the two groups, women in the Cabotegravir group had an 89% lower risk of infection compared to those in the Truvada group. And many people, I think, have felt uncomfortable when we as trialists talk about superiority. But just to remind you that this was the trial design and this is what we were comparing, is CAB relative to Truvada. But the reason that we think we saw this difference is probably because of adherence. And for many of you who have worked on PrEP programs in the region, you know that daily oral pill taking for many people, particularly people who, and women in particular, who are caregivers, who play multiple roles, taking a pill a day can be a challenge, and it can be even more challenging if people experience ART stigma or discrimination or judgments about their sexual activity, particularly for adolescents. And so I like to use this slide to really explain why we think that long-acting injections may have conferred an adherence advantage over daily pill taking. In the first panel are the results of plasma tenofovir testing in a subset of participants in the Truvada arm across the trial. And what you can see is that although people started off with high levels of detectable tenofovir, that's the blue bars, over time, so over a year, that declined to just about half who had detectable levels of tenofovir. And the red bar really represents people who were taking pills 7 days out of 7, and that also declined over time, with really only a third being able to persistently take pills daily sort of by 1 year. Now, these are plasma tenofovir levels. I don't have the DBS concentrations to present, but I think sort of the message is probably fairly similar. Now, in the other panel, we present the injection coverage. This is not cabotegravir levels, but whenever you provide an injection, it's essentially directly observed therapy. So we can say that well past 12 months, so out to 30 months, 90% of people who were expected to receive injections, in fact, did they receive injections, and that's across both arms of the study. But really, sort of that's the difference between these two, is that, you know, it was perhaps easier for people to come to clinic 8 weekly and have injections, not perfect use, but still more achievable than daily pill taking. So just a reflection on the 4 infections that did occur in HPTN 084, and Rafi's going to definitely do a deeper dive into this. Just to say that in these 4 infections, 2 of these infections occurred in women who did not receive injections. The first was a participant who delayed coming back for her injection visit, and when she returned at that delayed visit, she was identified as being HIV positive. And the second participant, at her week 5 injection, when she would have started injection, she was found to be pregnant. And per our protocol, she was then transitioned to open label Truvada. And at a much later date, she then seroconverted after delivery of her infant and while she was in the postpartum period, but still on open label Truvada because she was breastfeeding. So we really only have 2 infections that occurred in people who received injections. And there's more work in terms of pharmacology and HIV virology testing to understand whether this was due to declines or in drug concentrations. And you can see in at least one of the participants, they did have delays, that's that hatched area, in receiving injections on time, or whether it was perhaps because of the HIV infection. And the 083 data starts to give us some insights into some of the explanations for this. But, you know, we have far fewer infections in 084 to sort of articulate sort of the range of experience. And so we will need open label extensions and demonstration projects to really understand the full scope of HIV infection in women who take cabotegravir. So really, just to summarize, and I think the key messages that the team have sort of communicated in the last 6 months since we were unblinded is really that we believe that both agents were highly effective in preventing HIV, and we think it's incredible that we see an incidence of less than 1% in this population in settings where we're used to seeing much higher incidence. And so I think this is an argument for expanding PrEP to people at risk for HIV infection in our region. We observed that cabotegravir was superior or prevented many more infections than daily oral Truvada in this population. And we think that this is likely because of the adherence advantage over a prolonged period of time when people are vulnerable to HIV infection. Importantly, both products were safe and well tolerated. The only real difference in adverse events were injection site reactions, and they were generally mild and well tolerated. So in terms of next steps, we have been busy in the last 6 months with many things, including the development of a protocol amendment, which would allow us to offer open label cabotegravir to those in the Truvada arm. Ultimately, all participants can choose which agent they want to use, and we will learn more about choice under open label conditions. Currently, all participants have been unblinded. So the next step is to have this amendment approved and introduced at the 20 sites. Importantly, the amendment will include an optional oral lead-in. Because of the reasons that I articulated earlier, we didn't see many, if any, adverse drug reactions that would have prevented people going straight to injection. And so this has become optional in the oral lead-in, optional in the amendment, and we'll learn more about people's choice and comfort with direct to inject. Importantly, in 084, the amendment will also allow an option for women to consent to active dosing during pregnancy. This is in part because concerns about dolutegravir have receded with time, but also it's really important if cabotegravir is licensed for women of reproductive potential. Many of them who are at risk for HIV will also be at risk for pregnancy or want to conceive safely without the threat of HIV infection. And one of the key questions is whether the metabolic changes that happen in pregnancy influence what we need to do in terms of the dose. So the data we have so far suggests that there's no need to adjust the dose, but it will certainly be important to generate a larger data set. So we will ask additional questions about pharmacokinetics and safety during pregnancy. And the other important thing, and Rafi will explain more why we're doing this, is that in the open label amendment, we will include HIV RNA testing as part of the screening algorithm. So just to say that 084 is obviously a rich data set, and there are many more questions that will need to be answered. Everyone is working feverishly to support the submission, the regulatory submissions that ViiV will make to the FDA this year and to other regulatory authorities in the region. But additional questions that are obviously of interest are what we've learned already about pharmacokinetics during pregnancy, and also questions about whether we can have extended intervals between injections in women, which could potentially align with contraceptive visits. So that is some of the work that is forthcoming. And last but not least, just to acknowledge that obviously all of this work is the work of an incredible team and many people working at many sites who I think are committed to HIV prevention for women in our region. And they deserve incredible acknowledgement. So I'll hand back to you, Mitchell, and happy to take questions now or later.
Great. I think we will take questions later. Maybe just though, Sinead, before you go on mute, the open label extension, you said the amendment's underway. Just what's the kind of time frame and duration of the actual extension protocol?
Sorry, the timeline to get it into the field, or the timeline of the protocol itself, or both?
Both actually.
Yeah. So yes, many people want to know what we're doing, and we're certainly not twiddling our thumbs at the moment. Has been an enormous amount of work. Essentially, all of those 40 seroconverter samples have had to be tested both for virology and pharmacology in order for us to understand the breakthrough infections so that we can counsel women appropriately. So that has been an important step. It's been important to secure sufficient drug supply with ViiV, and that has also been confirmed. And then the final step is obviously to get the protocol and funding in place and to get it approved by the trial sponsor as well as all the sites. So we hope to release the protocol amendment to sites in the next month or so. One of the things that we do want to do is a consultation with communities involved in the trial just around the active dosing during pregnancy so that we can anticipate people's concerns and questions and any discomforts and clarify those. And then the amendment will run for 48 weeks from the time of sort of first transition. So we anticipate that will be faster in some countries than another. The pregnancy component of this will mean follow-up of pregnant participants from first positive pregnancy test all the way through to 6 months postpartum. So, kind of this will be at least another 48 weeks for most participants. And what we're also doing then is working with ViiV to ensure that there are access programs for the trial participants while we await approvals in the countries in which 084 was conducted.
Great. Sinead, fabulous and incredibly helpful. I want to encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A feature as we go. And I'm going to go from Johannesburg to Los Angeles and welcome Rafi Landovitz from the HPTN 083 team to present an update on that trial.
Thanks, Mitchell. And I want to add my greetings to everyone from across the globe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to try to share my screen so I can show my slides. Are people able to see these slides?
That's perfect, Rafi.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna, on behalf of the 083 team, pick up a little bit where Sinead left off, because I think as people are aware, 083 got into the field about 11 months earlier than 084 did. So we've gotten a little further in the analysis of 083, so we have a little bit more information to share that the 084 team is, as Sinead said, feverishly working to get for the 084 study. Our study design, as people remember, was essentially identical to the 084 study design, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I am going to remind people that 083 did enroll 4,570 at-risk cisgender men and transgender women who have sex with men at 43 sites in 7 countries. And we were stopped by the DSMB, though the blinded portion of the study was stopped by the DSMB. And as Mitchell said, almost a year ago, it was May 14th of 2020. Any of you who are at all familiar with the Broadway musical Hamilton know that there's a reference to the day the world turned upside down, which is when the Revolutionary War of the United States ended. And for us on the 083 team, May 14th, 2020 was very much a day the world turned upside down, because we really didn't expect the study to result out quite that early, but it did. And these were the initial results that we presented at the AIDS 2020 conference last summer. I'm sure everyone will remember in the Cabotegravir arm, we found 13 incident HIV infections for an overall incidence rate of 0.41 and 39 incident infections with an incidence rate of 1.22 in the Truvada arm. And that gave us a hazard ratio of 0.34, which corresponded to a 66% reduction in the incidence of new HIV infections in those in the CAB arm compared to the Truvada arm. And again, I know this is a very touchy term to use, but statistically, that was a superiority result. But as we were began the additional work and studying all of these data, we unearthed some new biology. And what I'm going to sort of follow up with, Sinead has already alluded to a lot of these data, so hopefully this will explain things a little bit more. So just to remind people, what we had pre-specified in terms of testing in the original protocol before we understood this new biology that is likely going to be applicable to all long-acting PrEP agents, not just Cabotegravir. We had, on the left side of the screen, you can see what was done at the site. And this was for every visit that a participant came in 083. A rapid point-of-care antibody test was performed, and also a 4th or 5th generation, that is an antigen or antibody test that was done on a laboratory instrument was also done. In addition to those two, before coming into the study, people had to have a negative HIV RNA test within 14 days of enrollment. And that was our attempt to make sure that we were not catching people in the window or the eclipse period where their more conventional HIV testing results might be negative, but they might be viremic. And that would be a particularly precarious time to initiate PrEP, because at least what we saw from the Truvada data thus far, that's a very, it's a time when you would be most likely to generate resistant variants, that is in the acute or eclipse phase if PrEP is begun. The information that sort of laid things a little bit clearer for us was we had always pre-planned that stored samples from the sites were retrospectively going to be tested at the Central HPTN Laboratory Center, or LC. And this was all done on standardized instruments centrally to make sure that we had a uniform way to interpret the data. And what was pre-specified, and again, this wasn't done in real time, so the sites had no way of knowing what these results would be. So you'll hear me say later when something wasn't detected at the site, the fact that we have that perspective now is only one that we have with 2020 hindsight. And I think that's really important to understand. It's not like the sites did anything wrong or or missed anything in these cases, the testing algorithm that was instructed per protocol was not sense enough to catch some events, and I'll tell you more about that. So at the HPTN Laboratory Center, a 4th generation antigen antibody test was done, and that was an architect test. A confirmatory discriminatory test was done, that was the Genius assay. An Aptima qualitative RNA test was done, and that Aptima qualitative RNA test was done not only at the visit where the site found the participant to have reactive testing, but from that visit backwards towards enrollment was done until there was a negative Aptima test found. So once we sort of began to realize that this central laboratory center algorithm was picking up infections earlier than was the site-based algorithm that we were using, we actually changed what we were doing in the central lab. We actually stopped going back only to one negative Aptima test. We started going all the way back to enrollment for all of the Cabotegravir cases. And we did a little bit of a bookend kind of testing, starting from the beginning and going forward, and starting from the first positive at the site and going back in the Truvada arm cases. We also did some quantitative RNA testing to accompany that. So I think a lot of people who have been studying these data and are familiar with it will remember very clearly this chart that I showed at the AIDS 2020 conference that describes not only those 13 incident cases that happened in the CAB arm with the categories that I bucketed them into to help us understand them better, but also the 2 cases, A1 and A2, that actually we found evidence on the central laboratory testing that they had evidence of HIV circulating before they ever received any PrEP agent. Again, this wasn't detected at the site. It was only detected on the centralized laboratory testing, and that's A1 and A2. You'll remember that I named these 5 cases the B cases because they were after a prolonged hiatus after the last Cabotegravir injection. So in my mind, I could understand how a PrEP breakthrough could happen in these cases. C1 through C3 were cases that happened during the oral lead-in, and the D cases were the 5 cases that, as far as we knew at the time of AIDS 2020, happened despite on-time injections. And those were the most puzzling cases that I think generated the most sort of head-scratching and interest among both scientists, advocates, consumers, and policymakers. So as we did this more extensive testing that I've now described to you, some of the HIV infections, it turned out, we had evidence for on the central laboratory testing earlier than we previously thought. So on this chart, I'm using the green virus emoji to show when the laboratory center found the first evidence of the infection, and the asterisk that's in black, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see, was when the site detected the infection. I'm now going to ask you to keep your eye on D2 and D5 and watch what happens to the green virus emoji after we did the more extensive back testing from the laboratory center. So you'll see that in D2 and D5, it moved earlier. And in the case of D5, it actually became a case that we had evidence of before that participant ever received any PrEP agent. So in reality, it was no longer a D case. We renamed it A3. And you'll notice when we, you'll see the publications about these data, it's called A3/D5, just to prevent any confusion about what happened that. When we also did this additional back testing algorithm, we also found one additional A case, we're calling A4, and that's a participant in this time period who also acquired HIV before the administration of any study product. So what we're ultimately left with was actually 12 incident infections in the Cabotegravir arm for an incidence rate of 0.37, and still 39. None of the Truvada cases that we had previously identified as incident became prevalent, 1.22 incidence rate. And so the interpretation of the data really doesn't change. The hazard ratio changed just a scooch. It's now 0.32, corresponding to a 68% reduction in HIV incidence rate compared between Cabotegravir and Truvada. So when we looked carefully at the pharmacology and the virology, we learned some important information, and I'm going to sort of distill it down for you based on each group, because we learned something different from each group. So there's group A cases, which are the 4 participants who had evidence of HIV infection before they ever got any study drug. What did we learn? We learned the following from these participants. If we don't diagnose HIV before PrEP agents start, so either in the acute or the eclipse phase, or very, very early in infection, before conventional testing becomes positive, CAB makes it more challenging to diagnose later. What we've come to learn is that because Cabotegravir is very potent at monotherapy, at reducing viral loads, but also delaying the timing of when these conventional tests become reactive. So the viral load is lower. It may even be undetectable at points. The Aptima RNA testing or quantitative viral load testing were the most sensitive tests to detect infection the earliest. And what is really clear is the rapid testing and the conventional 4th or 5th generation lab tests were delayed in turning reactive, and they would flicker. And what I mean by that is they would be positive and then negative and then positive as you looked at them over time, causing a lot of confusion in terms of how to interpret them. And if you don't diagnose that HIV infection before you begin a PrEP agent, it can lead to continued CAB administration because the infection is not detected, and even progression from the oral phase to the injection phase and administration of the long-acting product before that HIV infection is actually detected. What we saw in this situation was that if CAB infection exists and you provide high concentrations of Cabotegravir, we saw one case where at those high CAB concentrations, the virus escaped that Cabotegravir monotherapy and it was Cabotegravir resistant. We also had one case where Cabotegravir levels were declining. So addressing this question of the tail that I know people are very interested in and that Sinead alluded to. And when the virus escaped, and what I mean by escaped, it means the viral load increased to a point that it was readily and consistently detectable on viral load testing, it didn't have Cabotegravir resistance. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, these two different circumstances. When CAB escapes at high concentrations, it was CAB resistant in one case. When it escaped during the tail, it did not have CAB resistance. Again, one case. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, the group B cases. Now, these were people whose HIV was detected after a prolonged hiatus from Cabotegravir administration. These were the ones that I thought I could more easily understand than any of the others. This is what we learned. Like other PrEP agents, if you don't take Cabotegravir, it doesn't prevent HIV infection. I think that's pretty intuitive. It's not a surprise to anyone. We had 3 participants where exposure and HIV acquisition happened during the tail, and it did not result in Cabotegravir resistance. Now, I want to be very careful not to oversell this information. While we've all been really, really concerned, and we've had enormous numbers of discussion already about our concern about the tail and our concern that it would generate resistant virus that might compromise first-line integrase inhibitor resistant therapy if we saw it. In these 3 cases, we did not see that. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but at least in these 3 cases, it didn't. This is reassuring to me, but it does not rule out that it can happen. We need more data. So the other thing I want to mention is some people have really advocated that in programs, we always make sure to cover the tail because of this concern. I want to observe for you, however, that we had 2 cases where people were actually provided open label Truvada to cover the tail, and they didn't take it. And that non-taking of the Truvada likely contributed to HIV acquisition. So I've evolved my thinking in the role of what we used to call covering the tail to really move to this position that if someone's ongoingly at risk and they're not taking Cabotegravir, but they were before, what we have to do is we have to make sure they have a potent HIV prevention portfolio at their disposal, and that we're facilitating their use of that to prevent HIV acquisition. And if they're stopping the Cabotegravir because they're no longer at risk, perhaps they don't need covering the tail. I think that's a question we can talk more about, but that's how my thinking has evolved. Cabotegravir group C, these are the ones that happened during the oral lead-in period. And again, as Sinead mentioned, we're moving to a position where we're not, we're making the oral lead-in optional in our open label extension program also, like 084 did. Again, we learned the following. If you don't take Cabotegravir as an oral product or as an injectable product, it doesn't prevent HIV infection. Case C2, there was no evidence that the participant took any oral Cabotegravir. They never went on to get an injection, but they acquired HIV in the face of never having a detectable Cabotegravir concentration. We don't know how forgiving the oral preparation is to missed doses. There's likely a time of onset of protection with oral CAB the same way there is with oral TDF-FTC. We just don't fully understand it yet to be able to define what that is. We don't know how long that onset is. And if Cabotegravir as an oral product delays the detection of new HIV infection because of it's delaying the reactivity of these conventional assays, you can inadvertently think that someone does not have HIV infection and go on to give them the Cabotegravir injections, which will perpetuate the delays in detection on these conventional algorithms. As with the A cases, the cases where HIV infection existed before somebody ever received any PrEP agents, viral escape, so a viremia, a viral load that jumps up to detectable levels at high CAB levels or high CAB concentrations can, and in 2 cases did, lead to Cabotegravir and in some cases other integrase resistance. How about the D cases? And these are the ones that were most puzzling. And remember, there's only 4 of them now, but I want to tell you what we learned from all 4 of them. This is what we learned. That we have delays in HIV tests detecting new infections yet again. The Cabotegravir levels in the blood were as expected. There was no funny business where for some reason the Cabotegravir plasma concentrations were lower than you would have predicted or anticipated overall. So it wasn't unexpectedly low concentrations in plasma that led to PrEP breakthrough. If HIV smolders, and what I mean by smolders means it's really there, but it's not detected on Cabotegravir, it can lead to Cabotegravir and other integrase resistance. We saw that in 2 of these 4 cases. We don't know yet if that resistance could be avoided by earlier detection. I'm going to come back to that when we talk about what that means for implementation, because as Sinead already alluded to, we're going to be instituting routine viral load screening at every study visit in our open label extension to try and inform the question of whether or not this earlier detection can actually prevent the evolution and the acquisition of these CAB and other integrase resistance mutations. We don't know the answer to that question yet, so it's premature to say for programs you have to use viral load testing as part of rollout. We're going to try and inform that decision from the data in the 083 and 084 OLAs. In the Truvada arm, I want to be very clear that we learned some important things, many of which we already knew. If you don't take Truvada at all or not very much, it doesn't work. And the reason I think that's really important is 37 of the 39 incident infections that happened in the Truvada arm in 083 were because people were not taking the Truvada, period. One of them looks like it happened because of transmitted resistance, which is a very rare event. And the other one, we don't have a full understanding because we were missing some adherence data and the viral load was too low to actually get a genotype. So I can't tell you more about that last one. So these are my key thoughts, and I'll stop here, hopefully leaving a lot of time for discussion. In HPTN 083, both CAB-LA and Truvada were highly effective for HIV prevention. I think you've all heard me say this many times, but the worst thing that could happen if somebody thought that because we had a superiority result for Cabotegravir, it meant that Truvada was not a good prevention product. That is not true, and that is not what this says. In fact, it's an even more impressive commentary on how well CAB can do, knowing how effective Truvada is as an HIV prevention product. And it identifies that people who are challenged from reaching the full HIV prevention benefit of Truvada because for whatever reason, taking pills at a level required to see that level of protection is hard or impossible for them. As Sinead already said, CAB provides better coverage, we think, of these sex acts with an injectable product that is more discreet and for some easier to use. So as Sinead already said, in our open label extension, which is already in the field, we have about a dozen US sites that have operationalized our open label extension, and regulatory approvals are pending at the other sites. So we're very excited about that. The oral lead-in will be optional. And I will tell you anecdotally already, I've been surprised. We've been hearing from our sites that have implemented this, and this is all a US experience to date. We'll be very interested to see if this holds true globally. But we're seeing people actually want to do the oral lead-in. They feel more comfortable doing it. It'll be very interesting to see if that plays out as we get more of a non-US perspective, and if that's generalizable as we get more participants. We are going to be using viral load testing with point of care and antigen antibody testing as part of the primary screening for HIV infection at every visit going forward. I want to posit or suppose that I'm going to bet that in the setting of CAB-LA or long-acting PrEP in general, and I make that caveat because remember there are other agents that are in advanced phases of development that these findings are probably going to be similarly applicable to. Prompt diagnosis and ART initiation in these cases are probably needed to avoid resistance. And I want to end with what I have in red here on this slide, which is something Linda Gale Becker said at CROI this year in that inimitable way that only LGB can, when she muses out loud, that really is a call to action to us all. You know, and she said, and I just love this, and I really am grateful to her for codifying this thought so succinctly. If we can create COVID-19 vaccines in a year, why can't we challenge the global community to make better HIV diagnostics by the time CAB is available for rollout? I'll stop there. I want to thank our incredible partners, the team that put this together, and all of you for your tireless advocacy to bring additional choices to the prevention toolbox.
Rafi, thank you so very much. Absolutely terrific. Lots of great comments in the chat, some additional questions in the Q&A, and an enormous amount of information to reflect on. But the great clarity you provided is appreciated by all. I know we're at the top of the hour. We do have 30 minutes left, and we do want to get to a robust discussion with everybody. We do, as I said at the outset, have 3 additional panelists that I want to bring into the conversation. I do want to encourage you to put your Q&A or questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom if you can. We have another number of questions that are lined up, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. And I know also that as I turn to Svangile, Emily, and Richard, they may also put questions out for conversation with Rafi, Sinead, and all of us. So let me perhaps first turn to Svangile, who I mentioned at the outset is an epidemiologist and women's health activist based in Eswatini. And Svangile, I'd love to welcome you and get your perspective.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone, by our time here. I really appreciate to be part of these discussions. I just want to appreciate the information that has been given, but as I am wearing the hat of an advocate, we are just going to look at just a couple of questions. For example, questions that talk to issues of like, how do we envisage rolling out? I think some issues have been mentioned, like the community, the early diagnosis of HIV and things like that. But in reality, you know, maybe as an advocate, also to be able to to answer some of the questions. Already we are having some issues with the current PrEP, especially I would mention in Swaziland, around uptake, around adherence and continuity. And, you know, it will be interesting to see the strategies on how do we want to kind of like include as an option the CABLA. And then the other thing, probably we all know the factors around those issues, uptake, adherence, and continuity. It's centered around partner issues and also family issues, including the community as well. And so it will be really very interesting as they roll out to really look into the issues of realistic counseling or the investment in meaningful counseling and also the community literacy as well. And then the other challenge that we have in most of our population, this side of the world, is the passive receptiveness, not really voluntarism, but passive receptiveness, because you find that now I'm here, I'm at the health facility, so what is my health provider saying? So I just take it, and you know, then the other things and the stories, and they come, then it ends up, you know, people really not continuing. And if they do, they continue and restart and, you know, all those kind of things. And then it creates a problem. And then again, I think it has been mentioned, the issue of the diagnostics. And I mean, like at the health facility level, like when one has to really benefit from this intervention, the testing is very, very important, and it has been emphasized. And now we are imagining our health facilities, how loaded they are at the moment in the advent of COVID-19. And so how will we look into this and also look into issues around the testing and also the rollout, you know, as really preparing in making sure that everyone benefits from this intervention. And the other thing, probably, next slide, Michelle, please, is the administration. Now, is it a shot like the Depo-Provera, and you know, and how deep? Because you know there has been some literature which talks to self-administration, and so even those kind of clarifications would be really be helpful to really look into the possibilities, because we cannot lie. COVID-19 is here to stay. We are all on our toes, and people are so scared to even go to facilities and things like that. So even you find that in some areas, I think I've mentioned the issue of the limited partner and family support currently with the current intervention. And how do we envisage harmonizing or building on the current status to make sure that we don't lose what we have gained, and we maximize from there to ensure that there is elaborate community awareness, for the uptake of the intervention. And then I think the other thing would be, in some cases, how do we look into really marketing the different products, especially in the developing world, marketing them in the midst of the existing challenges? And then lastly, are there any plans or strategies and budgets, again, and most importantly, to look into the realistic, or should I say meaningful counseling, considering the health providers are staffing and their capacities as well, and also the budgets in countries that are really affected by the HIV epidemic. I will just stop there for now. Thank you.
Sibongile, thank you so very, very much. That was fabulous. Let me turn now to my friend and colleague, Emily Bass from AVAC.
Hi there, and I think I can give back time to the discussion, which is going to be robust. Thank you so much to the presenters and Rafi to really updating and moving beyond the core findings that are on this slide to really delve into this issue of what the diagnostic needs are going to be for CAB-LA. And I think you've done a great job of presenting that, so I won't sort of belabor this, except to say that, and to pose this question back to the group, that if we really have clarity from the researchers that there is a sense that the diagnostics that we have are not the diagnostics that we need in our HIV testing programs where CAB-LA is desperately needed, that really gives a sense of a timeline that needs to be in place, because shifting a diagnostic algorithm has implications for a whole range of things, as we know: guidelines, procurement, costing, all of counseling scripts, right? All of these different things. Given that timeline is coming into focus, and given that in some countries, activists and advocates who are either asking for expansion of daily oral PrEP or of Dapivirine vaginal ring are hearing, let's wait for the injectable because there's a sense that it's going to be easier once it arrives. And given that we want it and we see where the timeline is and we don't want to wait, we want to have everything as it's ready, is it time, and this is a question to the full group, is it time to get a really clear story about the full timing of both the product and the program, which probably will need adjusted diagnostics, and then use that messaging consistently to begin to talk about how to build a platform as things are ready? So I think that's my question, because all of these other pieces on this slide relate to that, right? We need to figure out what it's going to cost, how it's going to shift, about counseling messages. So really this is back to the group. If we have a sense of this timeline, how do the messages change? How does the story change? And can we do it together in a way that says, yes, we want this, and we want it with these other pieces that are becoming really clear that we need. And if we want this whole package, it's at this point in the future, and therefore we want these things sooner. Thanks so much for letting me be part of this conversation and for your presentations, all of you, Sibongile, Chilufia, Sinead. Back over to you guys.
Great, and Emily, that brilliant question. I'm going to turn to the panel in just a minute with that. And before we do, I do want to just invite Richard in. I know Richard's had some power issues and being able to join, but I'm delighted to see you on, Richard, and would love to get your reactions and comments and questions as well.
Thank you so much, Mitchell, and all colleagues who have presented. Just as Mitchell mentioned, and thanks Sibongile to bring up that conversation on some of the gaps, but also Emily. And I think for me, I also want to kind of focus on, yes, we're having the research and the results are all out there. We are seeing and we're having a conversation. But I think there also remains some kind of questions, and I want to focus on what do we really need to do in terms of advocacy moving forward because we may have all these products that we're talking about, but if at the end of the day they don't get to be consumed, then it's again a challenge for us. And I think this also comes from a point of view, like learning from what were some of the issues we learned in implementation of PrEP at the very early stages, and what have we seen in the past few years. And I think it would be important to learn from some of those questions and lessons that we have seen. And I think one of the things we find ourselves as activists and advocates is that all this science comes up, but the issue is always around our governments and also around licensing. So I think there's also need to have a clear conversation around licensing and also access, so that as we advocate, as science tells us, we're able to actually have a product that will be consumed or be into the communities. And I think there's not much conversation that is going around that. But also we should also tag the issue around resources. And as Bongil and others have already spoken about this, is that currently government are really focusing on COVID-19, and budgets are really moving so that the fight of COVID-19 is actually dealt with. So I think it also be important to also look at, we need to really look at the cost and who is actually going to pay for it. But also learning from PrEP, there are always questions of misinformation. And misinformation here, just categorically say it out, that how the oral PrEP, how everyone was saying it's only for gay men or for trans people, and it's okay, we shouldn't care because it's promoting homosexuality. So I think we should also, at the very offset, really have the results for all and really push out to say, this is a prevention measure for all communities, and I think everyone who deserves to get it should have access to it, so that we don't fall again in a pitfall of misinformation. And I think it will also be important in terms of what's the kind of messaging that we are putting out there. And also, if you're developing the messaging, are we also pushing it at the same level as the healthcare providers? Because one of the biggest gaps that we had was communities were aware about PrEP, but then the service providers were not. So again, that's another issue that when we talk about this, is that we have to really look what would be the communication strategy and how would we want to really engage on that moving forward. And lastly, I just want to talk about the need to also talk widely around the continuous implementation of comprehensive and integrated services or access to SRHR services like contraception, condom use, because we also still remain with the issue of STIs. And I think it will be very important to have much information out there so that people are actually aware as we roll out Cabotegravir, and also ensure that communities are aware and are able to also get services, so that we don't cut one angle just because we want to support one angle. Thank you. Over to Mitchell. Thanks.
Great. Richard, thank you. And Emily, Spangile, Sinead, Rafi, Chilufia, fantastic inputs, all of you. Lots of great questions. I know we have relatively limited time. Rafi's doing a remarkable job in the Q&A to answer some of the questions that have come up. And I'm going to try to get to a few that have not yet been fully addressed. I do want to come back to something, Spangile, you said, and a question that did come in the chat, actually, from Charles Brown in Uganda about side effects, and that in some of the oral PrEP programs, people may have discontinued because the side effects were seemingly a surprise. They weren't necessarily presented always fully to people when they initiated product. And Spangile mentioned also, being honest about what we do know about the injection. So I wonder, Sinead and Rafi both, if there are things specifically about the side effect profile that and that we can describe for this product if it gets to implementation.
I'm happy to start, and maybe Sinead can jump in. I think our concern about serious side effects that would not be able to be mitigated by stopping the product was the original motivation for having the oral lead-in, right? Because the oral lead-in provides, although a pill-based, a short-acting version of the chemical that is in the Cabotegravir injection. So the idea of the oral lead-in was to make sure that, at least as best we could, someone didn't have any sort of severe reaction, at least within 4 weeks, to the chemical compound that is cabotegravir. I will say, happily, we have not seen a case of any severe side effects with the injectable cab, at least in 083, that was one of those situations where we were wishing we could remove the cabotegravir from the body for some reason. So I think that observation with the additional observation that we really didn't see anything in the oral lead-in period that we were delighted we caught early and therefore prevented the administration of the long-acting version has really pushed us to be increasingly comfortable making that oral lead-in optional. That doesn't mean that with increased use that isn't a possibility, and that's always a challenge of these long-acting preparations. Once you administer it, you can't remove it. But happily, to date, we haven't had any signals for what that might be. As Sinead alluded to, the most frequent and differently balanced between the two-arm side effect we saw were injection site reactions, and those were happily brief and happily self-limited. And in 084, I don't believe they had any discontinuations because of injection site reactions, which sort of reaffirms what we all knew, that women are much stronger to pain than men are. And we had 2.2% of our participants say that was sufficiently painful that I don't want to do that anymore. So.
Great. Sinead, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to add that there, in addition to what Rafi has said, and he's highlighted, I think, sort of the biggest and only difference between the two groups in 084, which was the injection site reactions. But apart from that, there were no differences between the two groups in terms of adverse event reporting. But that's not to say that people didn't experience adverse events, but perhaps what we can articulate for people is that there are no new adverse events that are unique to CAB as far as we could tell. One of the things we were concerned about were based on sort of early experiences, and Rafi can comment a little bit more on the 077 experience, is whether there might be sort of concerns about drug-induced liver injury on the background of perhaps of existing sort of hepatic constraints, but we didn't see any evidence of that. So that was very reassuring. But I think sort of, you know, one of the things I've learned from the PrEP program is that, you know, kind of there are no serious concerns that we have and no differences that we observed with oral CAB, with CAB compared to oral PrEP, apart from ISRs. But we do know that people do experience, with many medications, they may experience adverse events. And sometimes they may be due to their another health conditions, and sometimes it may be due to the medication. So one of the things that we did see with a fair degree of frequency were gastrointestinal upset. And we've heard a lot about that from oral PrEP, that people sometimes experience GI upset. So I think it's going to be important to counsel people that they may experience some sort of minor discomfort or mild discomfort associated with starting a new medication, but that appears to dissipate with time. And there are no particular events that we think are going to be extremely different between CAB-LA compared to what we already counsel people around oral PrEP. And also, I think sort of one of the concerns that people had with oral PrEP were the concerns about people who might have renal insufficiency. And again, this is something that we don't think is a particular risk for CAB-LA. So for people who may not be able to start Truvada for that reason, or don't have access yet for Descovy, particularly for cisgender women in our region, you know, kind of that's another thing. And I think sort of what this really gets to, and what people have talked about in terms of choice, is that users will have a set of values and preferences, and providers are going to need to kind of match up sort of what those values and preferences are, and perhaps medical constraints are, with what they know about these products. And, you know, together one hopes, you know, kind of there'll be some shared decision making so that providers can advise based on what kind of users prefer or need.
Great. Actually, and we did get some questions in advance when people registered, and one of them related to that, Sinead and Rafi, about the open label extensions. And you both described the transition there to those extension programs and this opportunity to learn about options. And someone had asked, is there an embedded social behavioral science component of that? So when people are choosing between these two methods in the open label extension, if you're going to begin to assess how they're making those choices and why they're doing what they're doing in this next phase.
Yeah, so maybe I can respond for 084 because I think the two trials did a little bit differently. But in 084, we had an embedded social behavioral science component throughout the study. So during the blinded phase of the trial, we have all sites, we ask questions about product acceptability and preferences. And then in 4 sites, we're doing additional qualitative work to understand people's preferences and experiences on study, both during the blinded portion of the study and now as people have been unblinded, to learn about their reactions to the unblinding. And that will continue also through the open label extension. So we will also learn then about user preferences and choices, and also who is influencing to some extent some of those decisions, either partners or family members or providers.
Great. Super. Rafi, anything you want to add there?
No, 083 just did it, but as a sub-study. So we had a qualitative sub-study. In fact, we'll be presenting some early data from the blinded portion of the study at IAS 2021.
Great. I will say these open label extensions are just hugely opportune to learn more about options and choices, and particularly Sinead, also to learn about product use in pregnancy. So very excited about that. One other question that did come in at the beginning, and to Richard's question or point about being inclusive of all populations, of course, one population left out of these trials is transgender men who may be at risk of infection, and just curious if there's any plan to try to understand the product amongst transgender men.
I think it's a really important question, and we've posed that question to Vive, and they've not come back to us with a concrete plan. I don't know if anyone from Vive is on the call who might comment on that, but I've not heard of plans to date.
Great. I'll open it up in a minute. And I know we only have a few minutes. I do want to encourage people to raise their hand if people want to jump in. There are a number of questions about implementation and cost, the transgender men issue, and we are planning an additional webinar or series of webinars to look at some of these next implementation issues. So we will get there, if not on this call. One quick question that came up, and it was a hot issue and continues to be around oral PrEP, the time to protection. And there was a lot of debate in oral PrEP and whether it differed by gender and anatomy, but a question from an anonymous participant asking, do we know anything about time to protection with Cabotegravir?
So we don't, because we don't yet know the correlates of protection. So we're working, I'm going to keep using Sinead's word because I love it so much. We're working feverishly to try and establish what the correlates of protection are, which, you know, is a good problem to have because there are so few events. It makes it very hard to definitively establish the correlates of protection, but at the same time, that's a much needed piece of information to then be able to progress and answer the timing of protection onset question. And, you know, what we do know is that CAB gets concentrations in plasma extremely quickly, within 2 to 3 hours of an oral dose, and probably within a day of injectable dosing. But what we don't know is what's happening in tissues and what the pharmacokinetics are there. And we don't know which is the most critical parameter.
Yep. Great. I am going to want to leave just about a minute and a half to go around to all 6 of you to have a closing thought. But I do want to make sure we spend a couple of minutes talking about this testing issue. Rafi, your description was incredibly helpful. Emily, your point's spectacular and important, and I know you put in the chat. I do want to just open it up to any of the six of you of additional thoughts in terms of what the messages might be with respect to testing, both in the short term as the open labels go forward, longer term potentially for implementation, and also to just bake a question in. Someone asked, does this, I think it was Mark Hubbard, if I recall, asking a question about what are the implications for next generation trials with other antiretrovirals for prevention? Does what you all have seen, or at least in 083, tell us that we need to be doing something differently in clinical trials going forward? So I'd welcome any of the six of you to jump in with thoughts on those aspects of testing and communicating around it.
So Mitchell, maybe I can add my 5 cents worth to the testing discussion just on top of what Rafi has already articulated, because I think sort of what we've identified are that there are a number of points at which it may be useful to have more sensitive testing. And one of the places clearly is at entry onto PrEP. And that, you know, kind of the other points, it's harder perhaps to sort of particularly pinpoint when it may be useful. But I don't think that the trial teams are saying that yet that we should move to viral load screening for every visit. I think this is what we're saying is we need more data. We've learned something from the trials. We can learn more from the open label extensions. And we have started to have discussions with you know, kind of colleagues in different fora, including sort of the WHO HIV testing strategies work group, to begin to think about what data is needed to help make these decisions. You know, kind of, and I think what the amendments will do is give us sort of the test characteristics of each of these tests and potentially allow us to model so the trade-offs or sort of optimal testing strategies. So I think that's going to be an important piece going forward. But it doesn't stop us saying, look, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have large HIV programs and we're moving to viral load monitoring, and we're already starting to see shifts to point of care diagnostics, can't we get ultra-sensitive point of care diagnostics if we need them? So I think we can do more than one thing at a time, and we should. You know, kind of, and I do think that the problem that we've seen, or not the problem, but the issue that we've seen in 084 will likely be an issue for long-acting products, particularly those that have a long tail. So maybe those that have shorter tails, it may be less of an issue, but this is a good problem to have. It's the properties of the products that we want, but it, you know, kind of, we need to be able to work through it.
Great. Others want to comment on that? So maybe, and I realize we're just almost at the bottom of the hour, maybe I'll just do a round robin, and I'd love to hear both on the testing issue specifically and other thoughts and priorities going forward. An incredibly rich conversation in both the chat and the Q&A. We'll be collecting all of that and making it available, but maybe I will start where we started the call in Chilufia. Last thoughts, comments, or questions?
I'm happy to know that there are plans to, you know, look at other ways of testing, because that was an issue. But again, it has a lot to do with also resources, especially in resource constrained countries like where I come from, Zambia. So I'm still, you know, doubtful if that could work in my country. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Chilufia. Sinead, any last thoughts?
Well, thanks very much. This has been a great conversation. I think it's an ongoing conversation. I'm hoping that in the coming months we'll be able to share more from 084, but really welcome the opportunity to discuss all these issues and really to be in a position in sub-Saharan Africa where we have potentially more than one HIV prevention option for women.
Absolutely. Rafi?
I just want to echo my thanks for this great conversation and the collaboration with AVAC and all of the community groups to really bring these discussions to everyone, because I think we all need to be part of these discussions, and we need to be transparent about what we know and, more importantly, what we don't know. I'd want to sort of just conclude my comments with just sort of a call to action. You know, so many Western groups said at one point that it was impossible to deliver ART globally. It could never be done. And look what's been accomplished. So I think we have to decide where the priorities are and demand that the science and the resources follow those priorities. And I think that's our collective charge.
That is a beautiful charge, Rafi. Thank you for that. Spangile.
Thank you, everyone. Very exciting discussions. And one can only say we are looking forward to the actual implementation. And on the testing, I think really we need to look into, like, really how do we integrate it, this kind of sensitive tests in the advent of self-testing now that is out there. Yeah, thank you.
Spangile, I'm so glad you mentioned that. You know, we think about these new prevention methods. We also have new testing approaches. So really important to think about how all of this gets integrated. And just last week, people would have seen a Unit 8 announcement of a major push for expanding self-testing even further. So really important point. Emily.
I'm always double muted. Yes, absolutely. We need to demand and prioritize interventions. What I put in the chat, and I really want to say, is we have to have this conversation in the widest possible context. That in the past, when the primary prevention field has said this is a top priority and the house is on fire, even though it has been true, it has not gone over well. CAB-LA is a great product. I want it everywhere. If we say this is the top priority, especially in the context of what will be a fairly significant rollout, even if we have the diagnostic tomorrow, to procure, to rewrite guidelines, to do training, to do counseling, CAB-LA is not licensed. We just finished PEPFAR meetings where primary prevention was underfunded, PrEP targets were cut, and people were told the demivirin vaginal ring doesn't need to be introduced because CAB-LA is coming. So I want the revolution, and for me, the revolution is everything. And I am worried about a message, which is, why can't we get the diagnostic for CAB-LA? If we lead with this, I tell you, the treatment activists, who I am also one of, will turn around and say, not till we get universal viral load access for every person living with HIV, and I would agree with them. So we are at a really pivotal moment, and I would love to see this conversation, because I haven't seen these data published or presented, and they're so valuable, would be to have this with WHO, with country level decision makers, to really bring into focus where we are. This is so important. We need to move it forward, but let's get this to the people that are saying, hold on these other PrEP things because the injection is coming. Oh.
Fabulous point, Emily. Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much, colleagues. And when Emily was speaking, I was like, okay, tick, tick, tick. And also Raphael touched on something. And I want to say, we need to move this conversation out of boardrooms and get to communities and where the people who really need to hear this. And I think that will also mean that getting the science and the facts that we are getting and the results, to really put them in the language that people can really understand, and especially our governments. Because let's not speak as though there is a special fund somewhere that's going to actually support this work in countries. And just as Emily was saying, many countries are not even, like, during the fund being as a big issue, because everyone's saying, hold on, we need to study, we need to understand. And I think it's not for us to go back into a phased manner approach, how we struggled with the implementation of PrEP. But I think if we have the facts, and the facts are also with the policymakers, communities are charged to have the right information, then we can go ahead and talk about this moving forward. And I think we should also appreciate that we should not reach a point whereby we are putting prevention against treatment or treatment against prevention, and we shouldn't get into that trap. Thank you.
Richard, thank you. Thank you all, and thanks everybody who stayed well over the 90 minutes for these incredible comments. It's so important. I think something, Sinead, you said that this was a hugely important update, a hugely important conversation, and it cannot stop here. This is more than ever a message of how do we take this conversation forward with many others who are on the line and many others who are not on the line, about how to transition from research that was beautifully conducted, that generates great data and many more questions, to an opportunity to talk about what it means to develop the guidelines, the policies, the programs that make any of this real, and that it can't stop with a clinical trial result. That really is the end of the beginning, and now we all have to take that forward. So I'm enormously grateful. We knew we would not cover everything, and there, as I mentioned earlier, there will be some follow-up webinars as well as other advocacy and opportunities to engage around programs for choice, around advocacy for diagnostics, and around, most of all, a comprehensive, integrated, and sustained agenda that doesn't pit ring versus Cabotegravir versus oral PrEP, or primary prevention versus treatment, but that tries to move this conversation to a place that is making all of those options available in an appropriate way, strategically. And absolutely, Jim, and it doesn't stop with these products alone, because we need more research happening. And many of you will know there are next generation trials that are already beginning with a monthly pill, with the 6th monthly injectable. This is really just a point in time where things are going to get far more complicated, but far more interesting. And hopefully, if nothing else, far more collaborative. So I just want to say thank you to my colleagues from on this panel, advocates and researchers. And many of you are both advocates who do research and researchers who do advocacy. And all of us on this call, how do we take it forward to the many, many other stakeholders to make options real choices for people, and not get stuck in the rhetoric only. So thank you all. Keep your questions coming to AVAC. We are going to be setting up a series of additional calls for sure. Questions should keep coming. I know if they're about the research itself, Rafi and Sinead and their colleagues, and I should say Mina Hassanpour and Beatrice Finstein, Rafi and Sinead's partners in those 2 trials, were not able to join, but I know all 4 of them, along with the HPTN, are committed to engaging with everyone here and beyond to move this work forward. Thank you so much, and have wonderful evenings. I see some of you in Asia. Sleep well. Good evenings in South Africa and in Europe and other parts of Africa, and good rest of your days in the United States. Thank you all, and stay in touch and stay well.